Great, thank you, Paul. We've been working for a while now on some changes that we would like to make. We've been socializing them. I feel pretty positive that we may be able to, that we will be able to effect these changes, and I just wanted to talk a few minutes about them today. And apparently, the mouse. Yep. I need to use the mouse. Okay, cool. All right. So our goals when we started this were basically to just reduce the overall burden. As somebody, as the person who's the primary contact for new projects coming to the Eclipse Foundation, the welcoming embrace of making a new project open 400 CQs seemed to be something, an area that we figured we could make easier for people. It's worth noting that that's an incredible burden on the IP team as well. So we feel that it's important to reduce the friction here. But at the same time, it's important that we remain well respected within the community as a source of great IP issue mitigation, and that we make sure that the risks associated with intellectual property management are properly addressed. In a nutshell, how we hope to get there is by focusing on license compliance for third-party content. This is, and I'll talk a bit more about this later. This is effectively adopting what we call today Type A due diligence for all third-party content. Allow us, we've been exploring and working with some third parties of information. We do actually have a fairly vast database of our own, but we would like to leverage the work of others and, of course, community-sourced content. And again, I'll speak to this in a few minutes. And rather than having us focus attention on every piece of intellectual property that project teams use, instead focus on the areas of actual high value. Focus on basically dedicate IP resources and engagement with the IP team only on those things that are actually adding value. Just pictorially, and I should point out that this is very abstract and certainly not to scale. Today, we feel that we are on the far end, and I've got us on the right side here, far end of the spectrum in terms of the amount of energy and work we do to mitigate the risks associated with the adoption of intellectual property. Our target is to move ourselves again on this scale slightly, somewhat to the left. We believe that when we're done with these proposed changes, that we will still be doing for intellectual property management and risk mitigation far more than most companies do, and certainly far more than any other open source communities do. So this is just something to keep in mind that we've been using as a guiding principle as we move through this process. So bit more depth. What we hope to provide at the end of this is first and foremost with project code. This is content that is owned by the project team, developed by the project team, maintained by the project teams. We're not going to make too many changes in terms of process other than I'm hoping to make changes that allow new projects to keep their history when they arrive at the Eclipse Foundation. This is something we think is really important, certainly in terms of our own risk mitigation when it comes to third-party content. This is actually something we look for. We look for history and of third-party content. So we want to make sure that our history is made available. And I'm pretty confident that we're going to be able to pull that off. In terms of third-party content, this is where we're really focusing our attention. And I'm going to read the list. Probably I'll add color in the coming slides. Focus again, as I said earlier, on license certification and compatibility. This is again what we call Type A today, and what we're hoping to do is eliminate Type B style, the deep dive provenance, checking every line of code that we do on third-party content. The fact of the matter is that nobody else does that. and it's a massive amount of effort for what we've discovered over time to be relatively small returns. I believe all time we've probably rejected on the order of 3% of requests based on that full depth of due diligence. Now, that's not to say that we will never investigate anything deeply. Is as we, as I mentioned earlier, be a focus on areas of high value. As we identify content that requires further scrutiny, we will give it that scrutiny and go as deep as we need to on that content. We recently, for example, dug really deeply into Electron and found a few interesting things. Anyway, so yeah, again, we're going to continue to do that sort of due diligence, but only in those cases where it's required. We are going to focus on the bill of materials. Now, the bill of materials is the full bill of materials, all of the content that a project is leveraging, again, third-party content that a project is leveraging, rather than our current focuses, which is on every single individual piece of content. So that, again, this will give us a more holistic view and allow us to identify just those things that require further scrutiny. What this means in practice, again, is individual CQs only when they are absolutely required. I actually envision a future where, at least for some projects or for many projects and many releases, absolutely no CQs will be required. I think that that's one of the goals that I have in mind, and certainly we will eliminate piggybacks and any notion of add to orbit. And I have designs, and we need to think a little harder about what we're going to do with works with dependencies, but there's certainly something we're hoping to do something about. And then parallel IP is also going to become the standard. Right now, there's a number of conditions under which parallel IP applies. I'm hoping to remove those conditions and just make parallel IP be something everybody can leverage. The idea being that content can be used before it is more thoroughly investigated, or just be used while it is being more thoroughly investigated. So I put this graphic together to try and describe how we see this process running. And for what it's worth, we actually have a prototype that Sharon and I have actually been using. So we feel that this is something that we can accomplish. We're certainly going to need a little assistance in some aspects of it. But as I said, we want to focus more on the bill of materials for content and deliver that to a service. Now, right now, I have a script that we run. We're hoping to make that more broadly available. Perhaps this service is accessible through a Maven plugin or some other plugin that build tool specific plugins. That may be a future target. Basically run this bill of materials through this license service, which checks with a handful of sources of data, which includes our IPzilla data set, a product or an open community called Clearly Defined, which does harvests data and curates license data for open source projects. We have a white list of licenses that the board of directors has given us permission for our projects to use. And then as we explore this, we collect various overrides and information, the details of which I guess I could probably talk far too much about. But anyway, all of this information feeds into this license service, and from that bill of materials, what we're going to do is map to the various licenses of all of the content specified in that bill of materials. Now, it's worth noting that we're not actually scanning source code at this point. We are using sources of information. We are mapping library names to actual into databases of information about content, and from that pulling out license information. In the event that we identify content for which we do not know the license or are not confident in the license for whatever reason, that is the content that we deliver to the IP team. They do their review and then feed that information back into the system. First through a series of overrides, so that once the IP team does your does your review. The next time you run, it should just come up okay. And then over time, we push that information into the public, into the other sources. So in the example of the community that we're really positive about right now is clearly defined. So we'll be pushing anything that we find into our own data set, of course, and into clearly defined. So again, this is actually, we've got a working prototype of this, so we're pretty excited that this is something we're going to be able to pull off, and then again integrate with things like Maven plugins and perhaps have some kind of handy web interface, which makes this really super simple for project teams to use. And the idea again is that project teams can use this as they're doing their own development, and basically at the end of or near at some point during their development cycles, they can deliver it to the IP team, so the IP team can just validate, maybe identify the content that needs further scrutiny, and again, otherwise, just give the project team the tools that they need to move forward with confidence that the intellectual property they're including will pass muster near the end of a release cycle. In terms of timeline, we've been working on this for a little while. I think we probably first started talking publicly about this at EclipseCon 2018. We've been working on it probably a little bit before that, but we've consulted with various communities. We've been working with the board of directors, the IP advisory committee, and others. I've engaged the architecture council, not nearly as much as I'd have liked, and I'm going to be engaging them more over the coming weeks and months to basically come up with some modifications to the IP policy that we will need to have in place in order to implement these changes. We're shortly, hopefully over the next couple of weeks, introducing this to the IP advisory committee for some form of approval from them before we take it to the board of directors. We've been socializing it with both of these bodies for the last few months, actually. So our hope is to have an approval of a new IP policy by EclipseCon 2019. And from my perspective, EclipseCon this year and EclipseCon Europe is going to be all about intellectual property. It's a pretty exciting thing for me. I think it's a pretty exciting thing for the community. This would be a great opportunity to kind of be ground floor on some of this work and have some influence over how we update the process and the various tools that we wind up putting into place. My hope is that rudimentary tools to support all of this are in place by the end of 2019, and we will continue to evolve and work. But again, our focus will be more on tools and generally improving the experience for both the committer community and the IP team through 2020. And at some point in the future, and I'll be honest, we haven't really put the energy that we need to into this yet. IPzilla will be replaced by something that's more modern. Worth noting, again, as I mentioned earlier, though, when we are successful with these proposed changes, the requirement to interact via IPzilla will reduce significantly. So that pain will likely drop, hopefully a lot closer to zero. And we'll, based on that experience and based on how we continue to interact through IPzilla, we'll use that as our requirements into determining what the replacement will be. So benefits, benefits I think are obvious. Flexibility, we believe that this will give projects more flexibility to explore third-party content without directly interacting with the IP team and waiting on the IP team for clearance before they can actually do anything. This should reduce the amount of administrivia that project teams engage in. This should also, and I think naturally with less engagement with the IP team, we should result in faster service and just overall general better predictability, which has been a frustrating point for me for a very long time. This should keep our work queue more manageable and therefore more predictable. There's a certain stigma associated with the type A, type B differentiation. It sort of seems like maybe the nuclear option to just remove type B to remove that stigma, but But hey, well, I'm gonna take that as a win if we make it work. And this also, we're hoping that this frees up more of our IP resources to engage with the broader community. I mentioned clearly defined. We've been working sort of on and off with the SPDX community. We feel that there's a great deal of value to the Eclipse Foundation and community to have our IP team working with these communities, and we'll do that. And I think that's a value to the community, our community as well. I'll do a quick project update. Our simultaneous release went out on schedule in June 2019. Just some basic metrics. You'll notice a little drop near the end on all of our metrics. We had a handful of projects drop out for the last few cycles. This probably represents a certain amount of stabilization of many of the projects involved in the simultaneous release. I still think this is still a healthy shows a healthy chart of the work that we're doing there. Proposals, we have a very healthy queue of proposals. Basically, we're tracking this quarter pretty well compared to other quarters. The numbers for 2019 will track pretty well with our historical record. We tend to have a year-over-year increase in the number of proposals that come to the Eclipse Foundation, which I regard as a healthy indication that we're regarded reasonably well in the community. Handful of new. Here's a list of the new proposals that were brought to us in second quarter. Bunch of these are Jakarta related or EE4J. There's a couple of they're all very cool. I won't. I'll just leave it there long enough for you to read the list. And we're moving. And thank you to all of the member companies who have contributed content to Eclipse projects over the last 3 months. That's this chart. Your membership, your company logo appears here if you've contributed at least one thing to one project. So thank you to those member companies who are actively participating in our projects.
That's 70 or so companies that have been involved just in the past quarter. That's awesome to see.